Good morning. Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for 5 good minutes with the Word. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're in chapter 13, the parable sermon, and we introduced the whole notion of parables yesterday. We've already had some parables. We had one in chapter 5, chapter 7, one in chapter 8. Now we have an entire sermon of parables. And we're told in this sermon that Jesus always used lots of parables. And we talked about how parables, telling a story, engages the mind and causes us to think and keeps us from just zoning out the truth that Jesus would otherwise state plainly. But he knows who we are. We don't listen well. We don't even want to listen. And so he tells us stories. There are two parables in this sermon that are longer and that require explanation. The parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. And the first is the parable of the sower. So let's read 1 through 9, and we'll talk about those verses, and then we'll read Jesus' explanation. On that day, what day? The very day that Jesus' mother and brothers came to him, and we learn from Mark's gospel that they'd been trying to take custody of him, claiming him to be insane. On that very day, Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and great multitudes gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole multitude was standing on the beach, and he spoke many things to them in parables. There is a cove, a large cove, on the Sea of Galilee that you can be shown if you go there as a tourist, and they call it Parables Cove because traditionally people think this is where Jesus delivered this sermon. It's a natural amphitheater there by the beach. It has surprisingly excellent acoustics. And if Jesus had gotten on a boat, which is something that he did more than once, because we read about him doing it in Luke 5, to elevate him a little bit and set him apart from the crowd and make it easier for him to talk to the crowd so everybody could see him. It seems like it's the perfect place. 5,000 to 7,000 people could have gathered there. But anyway, so this is what Jesus is doing, and he tells this story. Behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell by the road, and the birds came and ate them. And as he sowed, some seeds fell upon the rocky places where they did not have much soil. And immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And others fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is something they had seen, all of them. A sower going out to sow in a field. Wheat, oats, rye, grain is the staple food of the masses. The soil in Palestine is famously hard and thin, and so needed some tending. The way most farmers farmed in those days was to broadcast seed, after which you would plow and overturn, the soil and turn the seed under the soil. And so he's talking about that time when he sowed the seed. There would be paths through the hardened paths through the fields, and he talks about the way the different seeds fall. It is a very simple story. We talked about how commonplace, how everyday these stories are, and yet they draw us in and intrigue us and make us think. So after the disciples ask him why he's teaching in parables, and he tells them, listen, you want to learn, and therefore you get to know things straight up. And Jesus tells them things straight up. The Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to be handed over to the Romans. They are going to crucify him, and he's going to be raised on the third day. He told them that plainly before he went to Jerusalem to be executed. But he says, these folks don't want to listen. And so I have to make them think. And he gives them the interpretation of the parable of the sower. We talked about the parable of the wise and foolish builders, and how that takes us to school on how to learn a parable. And it really is elementary school in terms of parables. It is learning to read. It is see spot, run, run spot, run. It's that simple. And yet the message is so deep and powerful. This is like going to high school. This parable is, because it has more moving parts, and there are a lot of concepts communicated in it. Hear then the parable of the sower, verse 18. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches it away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one whose seed on whom seed was sown beside the road. The one on whom the seed was sown on the rocky places. This is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but he has no root in himself, but is temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom the seed was sown on the good ground, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit, and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. So he's talking about the condition of our heart, and some of us are hard-hearted, some of us are shallow-hearted, some of us have allowed everything in, and some of us are ready to receive the word. And if we are, we experience miraculous, exponential growth. It will be various from person to person. But the agricultural metaphor is perfect, because that's exactly the way God works, isn't it? God works. I mean, what can we do? We can prepare the soil for the seed. Any gardener knows this. Any farmer knows this. And then we can plant. But everything else is up to God. Everything. We can't make a seed grow. We can't bring the rain. We can water, but we can't bring the rain. And if the rain doesn't come anywhere, we don't have water with which to... Everything is dependent upon God. What's dependent upon us is to prepare the soil and to receive the seed into the soil. And some folks have hard hearts. They have no interest whatsoever. I mean, it just doesn't, it's not going to in any way connect and click. It's just not. And it's because of who they are and who they've become. Some folks, they love it immediately, but not for the long haul, not anything for the long haul, because it's shallow. Some, they have deep enough soil for the roots, and the plant doesn't die, but there are so many other competing interests. Jesus talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount. You can't serve God and your stuff, you know. But then some have done the work, and they prepared their heart to receive. They've gotten rid of the weeds. They've made it sufficiently deep and sufficiently soft, and now they're ready for the miracle to happen. And that's the explanation of the parable of the sower. I've taken up almost 10 minutes of your time today. Next time, we're going to talk about the parable of the weeds. Thank you for joining me for another 5, now nearly 10 good minutes with the Word.